Hi everybody, thank you for joining me. This is An Atheist Reads Mere Christianity. Some of you may have watched the previous series I did in this same vein, An Atheist Reads The Case for Christ. This is going to continue that same sort of analysis and summarizing a work of Christian apologetics and then offering my own take on it from my atheistic perspective. After I did the Case for Christ, actually as I was still doing the Case for Christ, it became obvious to me that it was something that I enjoyed doing, that it was invigorating in a way to take on these apologetic arguments and find responses to them from an atheist perspective. The Case for Christ was a book that I know a lot of atheists are given by concerned Christian friends and family members. And even more so than The Case for Christ, this book, Mere Christianity, is almost a founding document of modern contemporary Christian apologetics. And it just became very clear to me that this was the next one that I had to do after I finished with The Case for Christ, because that sort of analysis was something that I wanted to continue. I wanted the An Atheist Reads work to continue. So, Mere Christianity. This series will be structured a little bit differently than the Case for Christ series, and that's only because the book Mere Christianity is structured differently than the Case for Christ. The Case for Christ had relatively long chapters, so I did a video for each chapter plus one for the introduction, and the conclusion wound up being a 16-part series. Mere Christianity is structured a little differently. It is divided into chapters, but the chapters are all relatively short. The lengthy divisions of the book are books. It has 4 books. Each book has a different subject that it addresses, and then the books are subdivided into chapters. So I'm going to do a video for each book of Mere Christianity, with the exceptions of the last 2 books. Books 1 and 2 each have 5 chapters, and I'll do a video for each of those. That would be this video for book 1, and then the next video in the series for book 2. But then books 3 and 4 have 12 and 11 chapters respectively. So for each of them I'm going to do 2 videos. I'll do 2 videos for book 3 and then 2 videos to cover all of book 4. So that would bring this series to a total of 6. This series will have 6 videos instead of 16 as the Case for Christ. So fewer videos in the series, but I suspect because each video will be covering a little bit more material than the previous series on the Case for Christ, the videos might be a bit longer themselves. We'll see, but I know those of you who stuck with me through the Case for Christ series obviously don't mind slightly longer videos than you usually would find on YouTube. So hopefully you'll stick with me with Mere Christianity. Hopefully I can make it interesting and entertaining and something that you will find useful, as I was very gratified to learn that many of you found the Case for Christ series useful. And those of you who are finding this first, who haven't watched the Case for Christ series, if this is something you're interested in, this sort of analysis, go back and watch the Case for Christ series, please. I invite you to watch it and leave comments, etc. It was a lot of fun to do and a lot of fun to interact with people, as I hope that the Mere Christianity series will be as well. So enough bullshit from the start. That's over with. Let's get into book 1 of C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, which is titled Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. And chapter 1 of book 1 is subtitled The Law of Human Nature. Lewis begins by establishing the existence and the use of moral standards by referring to the way people talk with one another when they are quarreling, when they're arguing. I love the way he says quarreling in his British idiom. They don't merely complain when they're quarreling with each other that a person is acting in a way that is inconvenient for them. They don't just say that the person they're quarreling with is being personally offensive. They appeal to broader standards of behavior. For instance, stealing something, taking something that belongs to someone else without their permission, is not merely inconvenient for the person who is being stolen from, it's wrong. And Lewis wants to establish that these moral standards exist and are being used every day by people. Humans quarrel with one another. Animals do not. And according to Lewis, to quarrel is to attempt to show the other person that they are wrong and that you are right, which means that there must be a mutually agreed upon definition of what is right and what is wrong. Unlike physical or chemical laws, humans are free to choose whether or not they obey moral laws, Lewis says. This is a very important distinction that he comes back to again and again. We have the laws of physics, which objects are forced to obey, and then we have the laws of morality, which people are aware of, but which they can choose whether or not to obey. Lewis also says that aside from the odd individual here and there who lack a sense of right and wrong, which we might call a psychopath or a sociopath, or people who have definitions of morality that vary drastically from the consensus, those exceptions aside, humanity as a whole generally agrees on what constitutes decent behavior, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. Lewis cites the Nazis as an example of this, asking how we could condemn and oppose the Nazis if there was not a standard of right which everyone could agree the Nazis had fallen short of, even the Nazis themselves. And by the way, because Mere Christianity was written not very, very long after World War II, it is very much a document of post-war Britain. Lewis will refer to the war quite frequently during this. And in fact, most of this was originally written for radio broadcasts. So Lewis talks about the war. This was written in the early 50s when World War II was still very fresh in the minds of everyone. So he talks about the absolute agreed upon consensus about what is right and wrong and how we need that in order to talk about things in those terms. He also points out that these standards of right and wrong have been shared by societies all over the world and throughout history. And even though there have been certainly cultural differences between as to what one culture considered moral and versus what another considered moral, but there's nothing like what Lewis describes as a total difference. In other words, there are differences within a commonly agreed upon moral framework. We have never seen, Lewis argues, what a completely alien form of morality would be like. And I suppose you could draw an analogy between this way of describing morality and, say, the structure of life on planet Earth. I mean, there's a wide variety of life forms on Earth, but they are all constituted of the same material. They're all their genomes are all written in the same language, and that this is sort of what Lewis is saying about morality. Moralities may differ from culture to culture, but they are still essentially, in the broad scope, the same. And Lewis also says that even those who say they don't believe in a real right and a real wrong will demonstrate that they do actually believe in such things, because if someone who breaks a promise to you would certainly be quick to complain if you broke a promise to him, etc. And how can you complain about being treated unfairly unless you agree that there is a mutual standard of fairness? So Lewis says that we all seem to believe that there is what he calls a real right and a real wrong. But according to him, none of us are really living up to those standards. We all are aware of them, but we all also often fail to behave in those ways. You see, the way he puts it is we often fail to behave in ways that we expect other people to behave. And then when we realize this about ourselves, we quickly begin to make excuses for our behavior, which is yet another confirmation that these standards exist, because we are trying to excuse our violations of those rules. And if we didn't believe the rules were there to begin with, we wouldn't even bother. So Lewis's point in this first chapter of Book 1 is essentially we all know about the law of human nature, the law of morality, as he calls it, which tells us what is right and what is wrong, and we all break that law as we go through our lives. So far, there isn't a whole lot for me to disagree with here. Lewis is clearly at this point laying the foundation for a Christian argument, but he hasn't gotten far enough that he has said anything that an atheist couldn't agree with. In fact, there's really precious little he said so far that I personally disagree with. But there are a few things. For instance, Lewis speaks about right and wrong, and he capitalizes right and wrong, as though they are pre-existing entities. They are real, independent from humans. And I disagree with him on that. But I don't think that it's an irreconcilable disagreement. For instance, check this out. Quote, quarreling means trying to show that the other man is in the wrong, and there would be no sense in trying to do that unless you and he had some sort of agreement as to what right and wrong are. In other words, all we need to have a concept of morality to which we are subject is to agree upon the definition of what that standard is, of what is right and what is wrong. If we both agree, then we are both entering into a contract, if you will, of what standard of conduct we're going to apply to ourselves. And Lewis and I agree on that. The only major difference between us at this point is that Lewis thinks that these standards we are agreeing on for our moral framework come from somewhere else. They come from beyond us. And I think that they come from within us, from ourselves, as individuals and as communities and as cultures and as a species entire. Moving on. Chapter 2, Some Objections. Lewis attempts to address problems that he says many people have with accepting or understanding his definition of the law of human nature, or the moral law, as he calls it for most of this book. Lewis argues that our moral sense is a separate thing from our natural instincts, since that is an argument that he says he has encountered from people who disagree with him, that our morals are just another part of our instincts. Lewis says that this can't be true because it is the moral sense that arbitrates our instincts and that tells us not so much what we want to do or what we feel compelled to do, which is what our instincts tell us, but what we ought to do. The moral law is what tells us which of our instincts, and for instance Lewis cites sexual impulse, the fighting instinct, mother love, patriotism. The moral sense tells us which of these instincts we should follow at a given time. And therefore, because the moral law is directing us as to our instincts, it cannot in and of itself be an instinct. And also that the instincts it's directing us to follow are not in and of themselves moral in any sense. They're not good or bad. Sexual impulse or patriotism or mother love or whatever are not good or bad in and of themselves. They are directed by our moral sense, which tells us what is good and what is bad. Lewis then defends his concept of the moral law against the claim that it's the result of education, that we know what is right and what is wrong because that's what we're taught by our parents or by our teachers when we're children, and we grow up having had this moral sense inculcated in us by education. And he agrees that children do learn their standards of moral behavior from adults, but that this doesn't mean that those standards are a human invention. And Lewis compares the moral law to mathematics. He says that morality, like math, is mostly the same in whatever culture you find it, unlike what he considers to be truly social conventions like fashion or traffic laws, things like this, that do differ greatly from culture to culture. Lewis also argues that moral progress is only possible because there is such a thing as right and wrong, which determines when the standards of one society are better than those of another. In order to say that one set of morals is better than another set of morals, you must measure them both by a standard. And this standard, Lewis says, is the moral law, the real morality. So, again, we're starting to diverge a little, Lewis and me, but we more or less still agree here at the end of chapter 2. I would say that our moral sense, both as individuals and as a society and then as a species, is distinct from our other instincts. I agree with him. I think that our morality is what tells us which path we ought to take. It doesn't direct which path we will take, but it tells us which path we ought to take in a given situation. I agree with him about that. But I disagree with him that this means then that our moral sense must originate exterior from us, that it cannot be a part of our brains or a part of a natural part of us, or that it must be some eternal standard that we all appeal to. I don't think that that is warranted, even though I do agree with him about the distinction of our morality from our other instincts. And I also agree with Lewis that, at least in a sense, that our morality is like mathematics. In fact, I think in a way it's a great metaphor for the way morality works and for what morality is, although not for the reasons that Lewis thinks. Like mathematics, morality provides us with an objective set of standards, or at least the closest thing to objective standards that we can come to, that allow us to make sense of the world. And like mathematics, morality is an abstraction. If we or some other sentient beings were not here to think about it, it wouldn't exist. Mathematics is a tool that we use to quantify, to explore, to recognize patterns, to explain and predict how our universe works. But it's a tool that we invented. We didn't invent the things that mathematics is applied to, but we invented the tool, mathematics, that we use to explain and understand those things. And in that sense, morality is the same. For math to exist, you need people to do math. And for morality to exist, you need people to define and ask and struggle to answer moral questions. That's how I see it. Chapter 3, The Reality of the Law. Lewis notes that he's not trying, in considering these questions, to blame people for failing to live up to this standard of morality, only to discover the truth about this standard. And he says that the important question is, since humans are morally imperfect, why are they morally imperfect, and what does that mean? Lewis compares the moral law to the laws of nature, like the law of gravitation, and notes that these sorts of laws only really describe what nature does. A rock, for example, could be the wrong shape for a given purpose, but that doesn't mean that there's anything bad about the rock. It just means it's not suitable for a given purpose. And an object that obeys the law of gravity by falling when it is dropped or pushed over an edge or what have you, is not falling because it is under orders to fall in such a circumstance. It's doing what it must do. The laws of physics are not binding, they're descriptive. The law of decent behavior, or the moral law, as he has a bunch of different names for this. I'm just going to start calling it the moral law. But the moral law is different from physical laws in that it doesn't describe what people actually do, but what people ought to do. And in this way, humans are not like other natural objects in Lewis's estimation. And again, he stresses that wrong or bad behavior is not defined by that which is inconvenient to an individual, since there are innocent behaviors which cause harm and we don't call them bad. Like if someone accidentally hurts somebody, we don't accuse them of doing something bad or doing something evil. But on the other hand, there are behaviors that don't cause actual harm but are still considered wrong or bad, like if you attempt to trip someone and fail to actually trip them, you're still doing something wrong, even if the person you are doing it to isn't actually hurt. And likewise, we don't define good behavior exclusively as behavior that produces a profit for the person performing it, at least not outside of the Republican Party. Now, Lewis turns to address the notion that good behavior is defined not according to what is good for a particular individual, but what is good for the human race as a whole. And this is sort of close to what I believe, but not quite. Lewis simplifies it and doesn't quite get it here, but I give him credit for at least tackling the objection. Lewis claims that this explanation of morality leads to circular reasoning. For instance, if you tell someone that it's bad to be selfish because that would be bad for society if everyone was selfish, and then the person comes back with, well, why should I care about society outside of my own needs? And you tell that person, well, because it's bad to be selfish. You wind up where you started. That's how Lewis sees it. And he says that it is preferable, instead of saying something like men ought to be unselfish because it's bad for society, or because whatever, you should simply stop with men ought to be unselfish. That should be sufficient. Lewis calls the moral law a real thing, even though it is not a fact about human nature. It's not something that was invented by ourselves. It must be real. And he says it is evidence of another kind of reality, of something that is above and beyond the mere facts of human behavior. Now I can really sense a divergence. Oh, Jack, I feel us growing apart. Previously, I just said that mathematics and morality are abstractions that can't exist without people. Now, not everyone thinks this. It's a practical way of looking at these concepts, I admit, that not everyone shares. It is possible to think of math and morality and other abstractions as real and existent, independent from the existence of thinking, rational beings like us. Math, you could say, was always there. It's just that we had to reach the point in our mental evolution where we could recognize it and understand it and begin to use it. And you could say that morals work the same way, that morals were here before we were. We just had to get to the point where we could recognize them. We just had to reach the necessary level of consciousness to become aware of morals. Here's why I disagree with this, personally. Lewis mentions how the laws of physics are really just descriptions of the way things work. And I agree with him. I think he's right about that. And I think that's something that people misunderstand a lot when they talk about the laws of physics, if they aren't scientifically aware, scientifically literate. You know, they might say something like, well, if evolution is true, why is it called the theory of evolution and not the law of evolution? And really, the laws of physics are just ways we have of describing and understanding things. And in that sense of those laws being used for descriptive purposes, we did create the laws of physics because we found that we needed them to explain things that we saw happening. It just made it easier to understand. If we could say, oh, okay, when you drop something, it falls. That's a law. Okay, that's easy to understand, and it falls at this rate, and it falls at this maximum speed, etc., etc. And I feel the same way about mathematics. Math and science are very closely related. Gravity was already there. Objects were still subject to gravity. Their movements in space were still determined by it. It's just that the law of gravity didn't exist until we came along and we felt the need to create the law of gravity in order to explain gravity to ourselves. Those descriptions didn't exist before we did, but the things they were describing did. But morality is different in this sense from math and from scientific laws, and that's because morality is concerned with the behavior of moral beings, of morally aware beings. And the only moral beings that we know to exist in the universe at this moment are ourselves, human beings. Humans are the only moral beings that we know to exist. Now, as Lewis himself points out, morality does not describe a phenomenon, but rather it allows us as sentient minds to make judgments about the rightness or wrongness of a phenomenon. And the phenomenon I'm talking about is human behavior. It doesn't describe human behavior, but it allows us to determine the moral value of it. And human behavior is the only thing we know of that is subject to morality. Animal behavior isn't subject to morality, since animals, so far as we know, aren't capable of perceiving their behavior in moral terms. Non-living objects aren't subject to morality, and neither are natural phenomena like weather or seismic activity or the motion of bodies in space, since all these things are the result of natural laws. They are what they are and they do what they do because, given the nature of the universe, they can be or do nothing else. The only thing subject to morality, at least in our experience, is human behavior. And human behavior did not exist before humans existed. Now, if you want to say that math existed before we got here, as I said, because there were numbers around, even though there was no one here yet to count them, that's fine. If you want to say that the laws of physics existed before we got here because the planets still moved the same way, even if there was no one around to notice and to describe them and to create a law, again, that's fine. You can look at it that way if you wish. I personally think that these things, the laws of physics, mathematics, etc., are abstractions invented by humans to help describe and understand and make sense of the world. And in fact, I find value in them because of that, not in spite of that. But if you want to think of them as real, independent of us, that's fine. To me, it's just a different way of looking at it. Because at least the things that those abstractions are describing were here long before we were. But I find it difficult to say that the law of morality, that the concept of morality is like mathematics or the laws of physics in this way, because the one and only thing that morality is concerned with could not have existed before we did. Morality can't predate the existence of moral beings, because without moral beings, there is no morality. Morality is completely non-existent. It would be like trying to say that there were laws of planetary motion before there were planets. You see what I'm saying? And again, Lewis stresses that what is moral does not coincide with what is convenient in this chapter. I think that's true, but that doesn't mean that morality must be an independent thing that is real apart from humanity. Human societies throughout our history have struggled to find the balance between what was beneficial to individuals, what was beneficial to communities, and what was beneficial to their civilization as a whole. There are these competing interests that have to be juggled, and it's not easy, and different societies throughout history and in different parts of the world have struck different balances at different times, but it's striking that balance that is the key for me. No one would want to live in a society that paid absolutely no attention to the rights and the needs of individuals. If the scale of balance was tipped so far in one direction, no one would want to live in that society. There'd be no freedom, there'd be no room to breathe. But at the same time, if the scale was tipped completely in the other direction, and all that was given any attention to, any value, were the rights of individuals with no thought to the good of the community or the good of the society as a whole, then it would be complete chaos. The balance must be struck somewhere. And that is one of the major moral issues that I think we all have to deal with as individuals and as a species, is trying to find that right balance. The point is this: Lewis says, quote, "This rule of right and wrong, or law of human nature, or whatever you call it, must somehow or other be a real thing, a thing that is really there, not made up by ourselves. But nothing about the way that we use morality or the way morality works demands that that be true, as I see it. And certainly nothing about it demands that it be the product of something above or beyond our reality." But that is what Lewis is going to continue to argue. Chapter 4, What Lies Behind the Law. Lewis begins this chapter by discussing what the existence of the law of morality implies about the universe. And he describes two views about the universe, about what it is and how it came to be, why it is the way we find it today, that have been held by humans ever since there have been humans around that have been able to think these thoughts. The first is the materialist view, which Lewis describes as the view that space and matter just happen to exist and have always existed, and nobody knows why, and matter behaving according to natural laws has just happened to at length result in creatures like ourselves with our abilities to think and to reason. And the second view is the religious view, the idea that the universe, including ourselves, was created by a conscious, discerning mind that wanted it to be a certain way for a certain purpose. Lewis asserts that both of these views have been held for as long as there have been people around to hold them, that there is not one that is more recent than the other, and that the correct view among these two views cannot be determined through science, since science is concerned with observing and explaining things, not with determining what, if anything, caused those things to exist in the first place. Lewis then describes man, or humanity, I would say, in a less sexist idiom, as the one thing in the universe which we know more about than we could learn from external observation. And the reason for that is because we don't merely observe humans, but we are humans. We have inside information, he says, about the nature of us that you couldn't get about anything else. And he describes it like if another race were to study humans without knowledge of our language, they would not be able to discern our moral law just by studying our behavior, because the moral law doesn't determine what we do, but what we ought to do. Our knowledge of self, our recognition of the moral law, says Lewis, is how we know which of these two views, the materialist or the religious view, are correct. And he says, since we know ourselves to be subject to moral commands, to behave in a certain way, we should conclude that there is a commander issuing these moral commands. Therefore, according to Lewis, the religious view is the true view. Lewis compares this commander that's giving us our moral marching orders to a mailman who delivers envelopes to each house on the street. And because Lewis's envelope always contains a letter, he concludes that the envelopes received by the other people on his street contain letters as well. Now, he says he doesn't assume that everyone's letter is exactly the same as his, but his letters tell him to obey the moral law, while the stones have to obey the law of gravity. He draws that analogy. And at this point, Lewis clarifies that he is not yet asserting Christian theology, only the existence of what he calls a something, capital S, that guides and directs the universe. Lewis says that we have to assume that this something is like a mind, or is more like a mind than anything else we could imagine, because the only other thing besides a mind is matter, and you can hardly imagine matter giving instructions. And then in a note at the end of the chapter, he mentions that in addition to the materialist view and the religious view, there's also the life force view, which is that human evolution and our cultural development, etc., was guided not by natural forces or by the conscious mind of a god, but by a sort of blind life force, the striving of life. Lewis dismisses this as a wish to have some of the comfort of belief in a God, but without assuming any of the consequences of believing in a God that would impose moral commands on you. Now, I've already said that I don't accept that the law of morality exists in the way that Lewis claims that it exists, but just we'll grant the premise for the moment, because that's what Lewis is going with here. I said after the first chapter that there's nothing in Lewis's assertion that morality exists independently from us as moral beings that contradicted an atheist worldview. And then I went in at length as to why I don't think that's right. But it is certainly possible to postulate independently existing morality without also postulating the existence of a being that Lewis describes as a power or a director or a guide that is the being that determines what those moral standards are. It's what we would probably call today an intelligent designer. Lewis, through his mailman analogy, tells us that he believes that the moral law comes from the same place as the physical laws. It's just that we are bound to obey the moral law. The rock that falls is bound to obey the physical law and the law of gravity. And if he can do that from the religious side and argue that the moral law and the physical law come from the same place, why can't someone do it from the materialist side? It seems like a pretty easy flip to me. Maybe these pre-existing moral laws are the result of some natural development of the universe, just the same as the laws of physics. I don't find the assumption of God necessary to account for the laws of physics, so why should I assume that God is necessary to account for the moral law? Also, very briefly, I didn't even put this in my notes, but as I was reading back through it, I realized there was something else. Lewis says that if another race observed humanity without knowing our language, without being able to get any inside info about us, they would not be able to discern our moral law because it doesn't govern how we behave, but rather how we ought to behave. I disagree with that. We don't break our moral laws as often as Lewis seems to suggest. And I think he knows better. This isn't what he's getting at. He's not saying that humanity is depraved. He's just saying that we are not morally perfect. But there's a difference between being morally perfect and moral. You can still be moral and not be morally perfect. I think if another race, an alien civilization, were studying us and knew nothing of our language or specifics of our culture, were just purely looking at our behavior, I think it would be possible, it would probably even be obvious for them to discern that we were living by some moral code, wouldn't you? I mean, they would have to notice, if they were paying any attention, that by and large we didn't kill each other. We didn't rob from each other, we didn't rape each other, and in those instances where people did do those things, they were punished for doing those things. That we discourage those behaviors and we encourage other more positive behaviors. You might not be able to determine everything about our morality, but I think you would definitely be able to determine that we were moral animals. Now, I've spoken about this next bit a little in a video I made a while ago about the moral argument, but since Lewis brings it up here, I'll discuss it briefly. Lewis says that his intelligent designer must be something like a mind, because the only thing we know of other than a mind is matter, and matter cannot give instructions. Unless, of course, said matter is organized into a mind. See, our minds are amazing things, and one of the most amazing things, maybe the most amazing thing about our minds is that they are the result, they are the product of our brains. Everything about how our minds work, our consciousness, our perceptions, our personalities, our morality is rooted in our physiology. Our minds are just as material as every other part of us. Also, and this is just a minor point to finish this chapter, Lewis talks here and elsewhere about how rocks and other non-living objects are subject to the laws of physics while humans are subject to the moral law. I think it's worth pointing out, just to remind people, that humans are subject to the laws of physics too. Our morality does not exist in place of the laws of physics, but in addition to them. We're subject to gravity just the same as a rock is, and we have just as much choice about it as the rock does. Chapter 5, we have cause to be uneasy. Lewis addresses those people among his readership who might be annoyed to discover at this point, at the end of the first book, that he's been building up all this time to a religious message. And he says three things to those people. First, to people who say that we've already tried religion and that's in the past and now we're moving forward from religion, and to bring us back to religion would be to pull us backwards. Lewis says that judging by the present state of the world, again writing just a few years after World War II, humanity has been making some big mistakes, and that in order for us to make real progress toward a better world, we first have to go backwards and start over again and move in the right direction. Second, he says that at this early stage in the book, he hasn't even gotten to the religious stuff yet. He's still not talking about the God of any specific religion, or certainly not the God of Christianity, only the source responsible for the moral law. Lewis cites two bits of evidence that we can use to learn about this moral giver, whoever or whatever it might be. And those two pieces of evidence are the universe itself and the moral law, which he's been talking about all this time. And from the first evidence, the universe itself, we learn that this something, whatever it is both a great artist and also merciless, since the universe is both beautiful and extremely dangerous to humans. And from the second bit, the moral law, we can conclude that this something, this prime mover, this intelligent designer, is interested in right conduct, that he values fair play and selflessness and honesty, etc., etc. In other words, says Lewis, God is good, and by that he means ethically good. He stresses that he doesn't mean good in the sense of being indulgent or sympathetic or soft. And he also stresses that his God at this point is not necessarily a personal God, merely a moral, ethical God. And in this formulation, Lewis describes God as both a great comfort and a great terror, since his standard of goodness gives us hope and gives our life meaning in our existence, a reason for being, but the fact that we have all fallen short of his incredibly high moral standard means that he must detest most of what we do. And then third, Lewis denies that he was trying to play a trick on his readers by taking such a roundabout route to start a discussion about God. He says that he was only trying to lay the foundation for a discussion about Christianity, since Christianity doesn't really make any sense until you demonstrate to people why they need the repentance and the forgiveness that Christianity offers. He says, to accept that you've broken the law, you must first realize that the law exists in the first place. And then Lewis says that although he finds Christianity to be a great comfort on the whole, you cannot find comfort by seeking it. You can find comfort by seeking the truth, but if you seek comfort itself, you will only find wishful thinking and what he calls soft soap. And on that last point, we certainly agree. Here we come back to the agreement. I agree absolutely. On the two kinds of evidence that Lewis puts forward that tell us something, according to him, about the something that is behind the moral law, the intelligent designer. First, he says that the universe itself tells us something about this intelligent designer, and I disagree. The universe can be explained without the assumption of an intelligent designer, and in fact I think the universe makes a lot more sense and is a much more compelling and more beautiful place than it would be if you assume that it's the product of an intelligent designer. Second, Lewis cites the moral law as being able to tell us about the designer, and we've spent this whole video to this point with me discussing what I think of Lewis's concept of the moral law. I don't think that it exists the way he describes it, and I also think that it's possible to believe that the moral law exists independent from humanity without believing that there must be an intelligent designer or some standard giver behind it. On his second and third points about why he has taken this route to introduce the subject of religion and God, that he hasn't actually gotten to the religion yet and that he's just sort of laying the groundwork for a meaningful discussion of Christianity. What we've got here in the beginning of Mere Christianity is essentially a protracted formulation of the moral argument. That's basically what this first book has been, the moral argument. And that moral argument basically can be distilled down to absolute moral standards do exist, and therefore God or something that created those standards must also exist. William Lane Craig and many other contemporary Christian apologists have used this argument formulated in pretty much the same way. And in that you can see how incredibly influential this book is. Like I said, it's really a source text, a foundational document for modern Christian apologetics. Modern Christians have really not only adopted Lewis's arguments themselves, but also his strategy of coming at it indirectly. You try to get from secularism to Christianity by starting with philosophy, and then you build slowly toward a sort of general deistic creator God, and then more specifically you narrow it down into a personal God, a theistic God, and then finally you finish off with the specific theistic God of Christianity. And Craig uses this technique a lot when presenting his arguments in debates. He always saves the explicit Jesus stuff, the talk of the empty tomb, etc., for very last when he's making his statements. And that's the same strategy that's also employed by advocates of teaching creationism in science class. It's not any particular God that they advocate teaching about, so they say. They just believe that we should teach people that the universe is best explained as the work of an intelligent creator, whoever that might be. And in this way, intelligent design functions as a gateway drug, so they hope, so its advocates hope, that would eventually lead people to Christianity. The difference between these modern intelligent design advocates who employ this strategy and C.S. Lewis is that Lewis freely admits that this is what he's doing, and he even explains why he's doing it. Lewis says, I haven't gotten to the religious bits yet. He makes no bones about the fact that he is eventually coming to an argument for Christianity. Whereas intelligent design advocates deny. Oh, no, this isn't a Christian thing. So Lewis gets points ahead of them for that, at least, if nothing else. having read the first section of this now, having read the first book, I find that I question a lot of Lewis's facts. Some of that is just because we know more now than we did 60 years ago when this was written, and some of it is just because I just think Lewis is wrong. I think he could have known better back then, he just didn't. And I question a lot of his reasoning. I disagree with him, but I don't hate this book so far. I really disliked The Case for Christ almost from the beginning. I felt that I was being condescended to and fucked with, and I really resented that. But I don't get that at this point from Mere Christianity. Part of that is probably because Lewis, even though I'm not really a fan of his at all, I'm not a fan of his fiction or of his nonfiction, but he's a much better writer than Lee Strobel was, which I think probably goes without saying. He is a competent writer, and he has a good voice, a good grasp of how to write, and that puts him light years ahead of Lee Strobel just in and of itself. So hopefully this will be interesting, and I look forward to reading the rest of this and talking about it, and I hope that you will stick around for the rest of it as well. I hope it wasn't too dry or too monotonous, but it should be interesting. Next time we'll handle Book 2, which is subtitled What Christians Believe. Sounds kind of interesting. So I hope I'll see you back for Book 2. Thanks for watching.